He told her later for the last time on a Tuesday night. Not with cruelty, not with rage, just with that practiced, distracted glance the kind a man gives when he has already mentally left the room. His eyes swept past her face like she was furniture, like she was a lamp he'd stopped noticing years ago. And Imani Bellrose, architect, wife, woman, carrying his unborn child, turned around and walked away without saying a single word. Not because she had nothing left to say, because she finally understood he wasn't listening. If you've ever loved someone so completely that you started shrinking yourself just to fit inside the space they had left for you, this story is for you. If you've ever stood in a crowded room beside the person who was supposed to be your whole world and felt more alone than if you had never met them at all, stay with us tonight. Because what happened to Imani Bellrose is the kind of story that doesn't make the news. It doesn't involve screaming or broken dishes or dramatic accusations. It involves something far more devastating. It involves a woman slowly becoming invisible to the one man who promised she never would be. If this story already has your heart subscribed to this channel right now, and hit that like button. Drop your city and country in the comments below so we can see exactly how far this story travels. Every comment, every city, every name tells us you're out there, and that keeps us going. Don't miss what happens next. Now let's begin. The charity gala at the Aurelia Harbor Hotel was the kind of event where everyone in the room was performing something. The politicians performed generosity. The financiers performed philanthropy. The celebrities performed relevance. And the men whose names never appeared in newspapers, men who moved cargo, controlled ports, and made problems disappear across 4 countries, performed respectability. Ji-hwan was the finest performer of all. He stood near the center of the ballroom in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, holding a glass of scotch he rarely actually drank, and he looked exactly like what the room wanted him to be. A powerful, composed Korean-American shipping magnate with impeccable manners, a reputation for absolute calm, and an empire that legitimate businessmen envied and criminal organizations feared. He was 41 years old. His face had the kind of controlled stillness that came not from peace but from decades of training himself to reveal nothing. People described meeting Ji-hwan as unsettling in a way they couldn't quite explain. He didn't threaten. He didn't posture. He simply stood there, and the air around him rearranged itself accordingly. Across the ballroom, Imani Bellrose was trying to remember why she had come. She was 33, and she was wearing a midnight blue gown that she had chosen, because Ji-hwan once said it was his favorite color on her 3 years ago, before he stopped noticing what she wore. The dress still fit. The compliment no longer existed. She was also 8 weeks pregnant. She had known for 11 days. 11 days of carrying this enormous, terrifying, privately wonderful secret inside a marriage that had somehow become the loneliest place she had ever lived. She had tried to tell him 4 times already. Once over dinner, when his phone rang, before she finished the sentence she was building. Once in the car, when he fell asleep before she could speak. Once at breakfast, when 3 men appeared at the penthouse door at 7 in the morning with folders that required his immediate attention. Once in bed at midnight, when she reached for his hand and realized he had already gotten up to go back to his office. 4 attempts. 4 silences that had nothing to do with sound. Tonight was attempt 5. Tonight she had told herself that this was it. This was the moment she would say the words out loud, regardless of what was happening around her. She had even rehearsed the way she would reach for his sleeve and ask him to step outside onto the terrace. She had rehearsed the exact words, "Ji-hwan, I need 5 minutes." Not later now. She had practiced looking like a woman who was not afraid that those words would not be enough. She spotted him near the far end of the ballroom, flanked by 2 of his senior lieutenants, Baek Do-yeon on his left, and a man she recognized as a shipping port manager from Vancouver. Beside Ji-hwan stood Yoon Se-ra, his public affairs director, in a wine-red dress that photographed beautifully and positioned her naturally within every frame whenever a camera lifted in Ji-hwan's direction. Se-ra was elegant, Korean-American, sharp in a way that read as decorative until you paid attention, and she had been appearing steadily closer to Ji-hwan's side for the past 6 months. At dinners, at airport arrivals, at press events where Imani had somehow not received the invitation until after the date had passed. Imani was not naive. She had looked at Sira with the careful, steady eye of a woman who had been trained to read the structural integrity of complicated things, and what she saw was not an affair. It was something different, something she hadn't yet found the right word for. But tonight was not about Sira. Tonight was about a baby. Their baby. The one she had been carrying alone for 11 days, because she had not been able to get his eyes to actually land on her face long enough to say the words. She straightened the fabric at her waist, breathed, started walking. She reached him as the Vancouver man finished speaking, and Do-hyun began responding with something detailed about a cargo clearance issue at one of the terminals. Ji-hwan was listening, with that particular concentration he reserved for business, jaw slightly set, gaze focused. The rest of the world genuinely filtered out. Ji-hwan, Imani said quietly. He glanced at her, a real glance. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Can I have a moment? She kept her voice low, entirely steady. Just for a few minutes outside. His eyes moved back to Do-hyun, who had paused mid-sentence. The Vancouver man was checking his phone. Something in their posture tightened in unison. There's a situation at the Incheon terminal, Do-hyun said, looking between Ji-hwan and Imani with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to have opinions about the boss's marriage. Chairman's waiting on a call. Ji-hwan looked at Imani again. The look lasted the same duration as the first one. Later, he said, give me an hour, and then he turned back to his men. Imani stood there for 3 full seconds after that word landed. Later, she counted the seconds, because she needed to be absolutely certain that this was real, that she was standing in a ballroom in a dress he once loved, carrying his child, and the word she had just received was later. She had lost count of how many laters she had collected over 4 years of marriage. Later after the Seoul acquisition, later after the Vancouver contract, later after the Singapore delay, later after the board meeting, later after the criminal business that required 3 days and no explanation. The word had become its own kind of erosion, each one small enough to dismiss, all of them together forming a landscape she no longer recognized as her life. She turned and walked back across the ballroom without another word. She did not cry. She was past the point where this particular wound produced tears. It had produced something quieter and more final and much more dangerous clarity. Imani stood at the edge of the ballroom for approximately 20 minutes after that, with a glass of sparkling water she didn't drink, and she made a decision. Not in anger, not in heartbreak, in the still, exhausted calm of a woman who finally understood that some structures cannot be renovated from inside, they have to be walked out of, before they collapse on you. She did not speak to him for the rest of the evening. He didn't notice. This was the detail that would stay with her longest afterward, not that he was busy, not that the crisis was real, not even that he chose it over her. What stayed with her was that her silence produced no reaction in him. Nothing registered. She could have left the ballroom an hour earlier or 2 hours later, and the result would have been identical. She was already that invisible. The car ride back to the penthouse was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. Ji-hwan was on his phone for the first 15 minutes, clipped sentences in Korean, then English. Then a brief stretch of silence before he put it away and sat with the same out at the city lights, the same expression he wore in meetings. Formidably absent, Imani sat beside him and looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the peach pie. It was a stupid, small thing to think about on a night like this, but her brain went there anyway. In the second year of their relationship, she had mentioned offhandedly during a phone call that she was craving peach pie, the proper kind, the kind her grandmother used to make, with the lattice crust and the thick sugary filling that ran down the sides of the plate. She hadn't been requesting it. She just said it the way people say things when they're tired and comfortable and talking to someone they trust completely. 2 days later, she'd come home to find Ji-hwan standing in her kitchen, the kitchen of her one-bedroom Chicago apartment, 3 states from New York, where he had no business being, with flour on his sleeves and a pie that was frankly irregular in shape, but completely correct in every other way. He had driven. He had not told her he was coming. He had simply come because she said she wanted peach pie, and he had decided that was enough of a reason. She had laughed so hard, she cried. He had watched her eat 2 full pieces and looked more satisfied than she had ever seen him look at any business victory. You crossed 3 states for pie, she'd said. I crossed 3 states for you, he'd said, as though this were an obvious and logical distinction. She had believed him. For years she had believed him. Penthouse was cold in the specific way expensive. Under-lived-in spaces become cold not from temperature, but from absence. Too much marble. Too many surfaces that reflected light without warmth. Too many rooms that existed for no real reason other than to signal scale. Ji-hwan kissed her forehead on his way to the private office. Routine. Reflexive. The kind of affection that had stopped being an expression and become a habit, like locking a door before bed. Don't wait up, he said. She watched him close the office door. Then she stood in the kitchen for a long moment, looking at the marble counter, looking at the photograph on the refrigerator, the 2 of them in coastal Maine from 3 years ago, before everything calcified. Both of them wind-blown and squinting into the sun, genuinely laughing at something, and the clarity she'd reached in the ballroom came back, with a completeness she hadn't expected. She was not going to tell him tonight. She was not going to tell him at all. Not like this. She went upstairs. She took the suitcase from the back of the closet, not the large one, not the travel set they used for long trips, but the single mid-size bag that fit everything that actually mattered. She moved quietly and with focus, because focusing was what kept her hands from shaking. Simple clothes, her prenatal vitamins, her passport, her architectural sketchbooks, 3 of them, filled with drawings she had mostly stopped adding to over the past 2 years. And from the bottom drawer of her desk, folded inside a gray linen envelope, the detailed drawings of the coastal house. The house that had been their idea. 4 years ago, on a Maine shoreline on a weekend trip that was supposed to be a compromise between her need for quiet and his inability to fully stop working, they had stood on a rocky beach and talked about the future, the way people do when they are genuinely inside love, and not yet managing it from a careful distance. She had pulled out her sketchbook right there on the beach and started roughing out what it might look like. A cedar house, wide windows facing the Atlantic, a wraparound porch, enough bookshelves to be ridiculous, a kitchen with morning light. Ji-hwan had stood behind her, watching her draw, and said, "Build it exactly like that." When, she'd asked. Whenever, he'd said. We've got time. She had believed that too. She took the drawings. She carried the suitcase down to the kitchen. She stood at the marble island and took off her wedding ring, the thin platinum band that had felt like a promise and had slowly become a piece of jewelry she wore, out of habit, and set it on the counter beside. Photograph of the 2 of them on the Maine coast. Then she found a notepad and a pen, and she wrote 1 sentence. She did not write a speech. She did not write accusations or explanations or the careful argument she'd been constructing in her head for months. She wrote 1 sentence, because 1 sentence was what remained of everything she had tried to say. I cannot keep disappearing just because you stopped looking. She left it folded beside the ring. Then she called for a car. She took the elevator down. She walked out of the building with 1 suitcase and crossed the sidewalk and got in the back seat of the car, and the door closed, and the city moved past the windows, and she pressed 1 hand very gently against her stomach. Okay, she said softly, to herself, to the small life inside her, to whatever came next. She was 17 blocks away before the first tears came. She didn't try to stop them. She sat in the dark back seat and let them happen, because she had been holding them back for the better part of 4 years, and her body deserved to let go of something. They weren't tears of collapse. They weren't the tears of a woman who didn't know what she was doing. They were the tears of a woman who finally did. She had loved Ji-hwan in the uncomplicated way that only becomes complicated once it meets real life. She had loved him through his silence and his 12-hour absences and the months when his attention was so completely elsewhere, that she had started scheduling moments with him in her head, the way you a medical appointment, hoping for a slot, grateful when one opened, adjusting when it didn't. She had loved him through the year she stopped drawing, because she was too occupied supporting the edges of his life to build anything in her own. She had loved him through where Sarah stood closer than she should have, and through the invitations that arrived after the events they were meant for. She had loved him through the 4 attempts at saying the words and through the one moment tonight when he looked at her face and chose his shipping terminal instead. She had loved him, and it had almost cost her everything she was. The car crossed the bridge. The city fell away behind her. She was at the airport before midnight. She had called Odessa Langley from the car Odessa, who had been a nurse in the same Chicago hospital where Imani's mother had spent her last months, who had moved to coastal Maine after retirement, and who had called Imani every birthday for 10 years and meant it. Odessa, who answered on the second ring at 11:30 at night and said how soon, before Imani finished explaining. "First flight," Imani said. "I'll have the bed ready," was the most efficient love Imani had experienced in longer than she could accurately remember. She sat in the departures terminal and held her sketchbook on her lap and stared at the drawing of the cedar house. Wide windows, a porch, morning light. She had drawn it in pencil, and the graphite had smudged slightly at the edges from being folded and unfolded over the years. She wondered if Ji-hwan would notice she was gone before morning. She thought probably not until afternoon. She was wrong, it would be 3 days, but her estimate was close enough to be its own kind of answer. At Gate 7, Imani Bellrose sat with one suitcase, one sketchbook, one unborn child, and the architectural drawings of a house that had never been built. She was exhausted in every possible way, and she was, for the first time in years, entirely herself. The boarding call came. She stood up, adjusted the suitcase handle, and walked forward. Behind her, back in a Manhattan penthouse, the office light burned under a closed door. A wedding ring sat cold on a marble island beside a folded piece of paper. A phone rang with business that demanded immediate attention. And Ji-hwan, feared across 4 countries, master of silence and control, solver of crises that would topple ordinary men, heard none of it. He was too busy being important. His wife was already gone. Ji-hwan found the note on a Wednesday morning, not Tuesday night when she left. Not in the small hours when the office work finally ended and he moved through the penthouse in the dark the way he always did, checking locks, turning off lights, operating on the muscle memory of a man who had learned long ago that security meant knowing every exit in any room he occupied. He had passed through the kitchen at 2 in the morning and not looked at the counter. He had gone to bed and reached across the mattress with the automatic, half-conscious habit of a man who expected a warm body on the other side, found the sheets cool and undisturbed, and told himself she had fallen asleep in the reading chair again. He had woken at 6, showered, dressed, and was on his second phone call of the morning before he walked back through the kitchen and saw it. The ring first, small and platinum against dark marble, catching the early light in a way that made it look like something spilled rather than something placed. His brain registered it as wrong before his eyes had fully processed what he was looking at, the way the body sometimes knows things, a full second before the conscious mind catches up. He picked it up. It was warm from the light. That detail was wrong too. It should have been cold, left there overnight, and the fact that it felt warm was his mind lying to him, insisting on impossibilities, because the alternative was the thing sitting folded beside it. He set the ring down. He picked up the note. "I cannot keep disappearing just because you stopped looking." He read it twice. Then he stood at the kitchen counter for a long time, with the note in one hand, and his phone, still warm from the call he had just ended. And he did the thing he had trained himself never to do in any situation that required strategic thinking. He felt it all at once. Not grief exactly, not yet. Something rawer than that, the particular shock of a man who has spent decades anticipating threats from every direction, suddenly blindsided by the one that came from inside his own home. The one he had somehow catastrophically failed to classify as a threat at all. He called her phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording said she'd get back to you as soon as she could, in the steady, unhurried tone she used for professional calls, the one that said she was competent and reliable and not to be underestimated, and the sound of it made something happen in his chest that he hadn't experienced since he was 19. Years old, and had lost something he couldn't get back. Called again. Voicemail. He put the phone face down on the counter and looked at the photograph beside the ring. The two of them on a Maine beach, both squinting, both laughing. He remembered that day. He remembered that she had made him stop walking so she could pick up a piece of sea glass, and he had stood there watching her hold it up to the light with the total focused attention she gave beautiful things, and he had thought, standing there like an idiot in the wind, this is the only thing I've ever wanted to protect that can't be protected with money or men. He had not thought about that day in approximately 2 years. He picked his phone back up and called Do-Yun. Baek Do-Yun arrived at the penthouse within 40 minutes, which was faster than the midtown traffic should have allowed, which meant he had pushed the driver, and he had known, from the tone of a single sentence, that this was not a call he should take slowly. He was 38, lean in the particular way of men who stayed fit not for aesthetics, but because their survival had occasionally depended on it, and he had worked alongside Ji-hwan for 11 years, in the way that certain partnerships form in criminal organizations, not from affection but from proven reliability, tested through enough genuine crises that trust had calcified into something close to loyalty. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the note Ji-hwan held out to him. He read it once. How long has she been gone? I don't know, Ji-hwan said. And the admission cost him something, visibly, in the set of his jaw. She was at the gala. She left from here sometime after midnight, I think. I didn't hear her go. Do-Yun looked at him steadily for a moment. Her phone, off or ignored family? Her sister is in Atlanta. I called. She hasn't heard from her. This was a lie Imani's sister Camille had picked up immediately, and the half-second pause, before she said she hadn't spoken to Imani recently, was the pause of a woman who had been coached, or was choosing a side. Had noted it and filed it, and not pushed, because pushing a grieving woman's sister over the phone at 7 in the morning was not a strategy that produced useful information. Do-Yun set the note back on the counter. His face was careful in a way Ji-hwan recognized as the face he wore when he was managing information. Do-Yun, I'll find her. That's not what I asked you. A pause that lasted about 4 seconds too long. There are things I should probably tell you, Do-Yun said. I've been sitting on information, waiting to confirm it fully before I brought it to you, because it involves people inside the organization, and I wanted to be certain. Kitchen became a different kind of room. Tell me now, Ji-hwan said. His voice didn't change in volume or tone, but something in it flattened out in the specific way that the people who worked for him had learned to recognize as genuinely dangerous. Do-Yun pulled out his phone and set it on the counter between them, screen up, open to a series of forwarded emails and redirected calendar entries. It started about 8 months ago. Invitations that were sent to both of you, the MoMA dinner in October, the waterfront opening in November, 3 events in December. Sound Greenwood splitting. Imani's confirmations were intercepted. RSVPs sent back declining on her behalf, from an email address that's close enough to hers that no one would have questioned it without looking carefully. Ji-hwan looked at the screen. Someone with access to your office calendar also began routing your schedule to avoid overlap with hers. Minor things at first meetings that ran long into dinners, calls that were timed for evenings. Then it became more structural, overnight trips. The Seoul visit in February, that was extended by 4 days. The Vancouver problem last month that required your personal presence when it absolutely did not. The silence in the kitchen was not comfortable. Who, Ji-hwan said. Chairman Han Gyong-soo, Do-Yun said. I have 3 separate confirmations. 2 from inside his own office staff, 1 from the event coordinator at the MoMA dinner who still has the original email chain. Ji-hwan stood completely still. Han Gyong-soo was 64 years old, a founding strategist of the Mujin organization, a man who had helped build the syndicate's financial architecture across 3 decades and whose institutional memory made him effectively irreplaceable in any calculation about what the organization could afford to lose. He was also a man who had expressed, in careful, indirect, thoroughly deniable language, that he found Imani unsuitable. Not dangerous, not disloyal, unsuitable, too private. Too American in a particular way that he described, once, in a closed meeting, as not understanding what it meant to be beside a man in Ji-hwan's position. Ji-hwan had listened to that and said nothing and considered it at the time. The minor opinion of an older man who had different ideas about what a wife should be, and he had not pushed back, and he had not defended Imani, and that failure was now sitting cold and clear in front of him. "Where is he?" Ji-hwan said. "His office in Midtown. He's expecting a strategy meeting with you at 10. Ji-hwan looked at the ring on the counter. "Don't cancel it," he said. The meeting room on the 34th floor of the Quan Meridian Holdings building was glass-walled on two sides, which had always struck Ji-hwan as an architectural choice that communicated either absolute confidence or complete foolishness, the willingness to be seen from all directions. On days when the light came in from the south, it turned the room gold in a way that made everything inside it look important. Gyeong-soo was already seated when Ji-hwan arrived. 64 years old, silver-haired, wearing the posture of a man who had survived enough internal politics to feel relatively secure in any configuration of this particular room. He had a folder in front of him and a cup of tea, and the settled expression of someone who most expected this meeting to go the way most of his meetings went in his general direction. Two other men were present associates of Gyeong-soo's whom Ji-hwan recognized as part of his inner circle. Ji-hwan sat down across from him. Du-yun stood to the side. "Leave us," Ji-hwan said to the two associates. Gyeong-soo looked up. Something shifted in his eyes, not fear, not quite yet, but the first registration of a room that was different from what he had expected. The two men left. Ji-hwan placed his phone on the table with the screen down and looked at Gyeong-soo for a long moment. "Tell me about the October MoMA event," Ji-hwan said. The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Gyeong-soo said. His voice was steady. His tea was not. "Your hand is shaking," Ji-hwan said conversationally. "That's new." Gyeong-soo set the cup down. "Ji-hwan, if this is about Mrs. Hwan's, her name is Imani." Another pause. "If this is about Imani, I think there are aspects of this situation you may be seeing out of context." "Walk me through the context," Ji-hwan said. "Start with the calendar. Then we'll discuss the invitations. Then you'll explain to me, in whatever context you feel is appropriate, why you spent 8 months systematically engineering the disappearance of my wife from my life." Gyeong-soo sat back. When he spoke, he did not apologize. He was too old and too proud and possibly too genuinely convinced of himself to apologize. And that, Ji-hwan would reflect later, was what turned a confrontation into something that could not be undone. "She was making you soft," Gyeong-soo said. "That's the honest answer. I've watched you for 20 years, Ji-hwan. I helped build what you are. And I watched that woman come into your world and begin pulling you away from it. She had no interest in what we are, no understanding. She made you." He paused, choosing his word smaller. "She made me a person," Ji-hwan said. "You can't afford to be a person. Not in your position." The room was very quiet. "And my wife," Ji-hwan said. "The one who has now left, because the man she married stopped being visible to her. She's an acceptable loss in your calculation." Gyeong-soo met his eyes. "A boss cannot. She is pregnant," Ji-hwan said. The sentence hit the room like something dropped from a height. Gyeong-soo's face changed, the first genuine change in his expression. Since Ji-hwan sat down, it was not remorse that moved across it. It was the recalibration of a tactician encountering new information that changes the map. Ji-hwan watched him process it, and that watching was what finished everything. Because Gyeong-soo looked at the information about an unborn child and reached for its strategic implications before he reached for anything human, and in that sequence of 3 seconds, Ji-hwan saw exactly who the man across the table had always been, and understood exactly how he himself had allowed this. He had surrounded himself with people who did not flinch. He had built an organization that rewarded the absence of sentiment. He had prized calculation and punished hesitation for so long that he had inadvertently built a world in which a man could spend 8 months destroying a marriage and reach for strategic relevance before reaching for basic human decency and consider himself throughout to be acting conscious of something important. "I'm going to tell you what happens now," Ji-hwan said. His voice was exactly what it always was, quiet, level. The voice of a man who did not need volume to make rooms change. Your financial access to every Quan Meridian account ends at close of business today. Your authority within the Mujin organization is revoked effective immediately. The contracts you control in Vancouver and Singapore will be reassigned. Every lieutenant who participated in what you did to my wife's schedule will be identified and dealt with separately. He paused. And you will never be in a room that I am in again. Gyong-su looked at him for a long moment. The old pride was still in there. The man was constitutionally incapable of full collapse, but something behind it had gone out. You're making a mistake, he said. You called my wife replaceable, Ji-hwan said. He stood up. I'm not making a mistake. I'm correcting one. He left the room without another word. The drive back to the penthouse took 22 minutes, and Ji-hwan spent all of them looking out the window at the city, moving past and feeling, beneath the structural coldness he wore by long practice, something that he did not have a clean word for. Victory was wrong. There was nothing about this that felt like winning. Jeong-soo had been removed. His network was being dismantled by phone calls Do-yoon was making from the front seat. The lieutenants who had assisted would be identified and handled with the same controlled efficiency that Ji-hwan brought to every threat, not through violence, which was almost always unnecessary if you understood leverage, but through the quiet removal of access, income, and protection that made violence irrelevant. The organization was being corrected. His marriage was not. Because he understood, in the elevator back to the penthouse, a truth that no strategic action could address. Jeong-soo had created the opportunities. Ji-hwan had allowed them to function. You cannot systematically exclude someone from a man's life if that man is actively looking at her. You cannot intercept invitations if the man notices she hasn't mentioned them. You cannot fill a schedule with manufactured crises if the man comes home and asks his wife how she is and actually waits for the answer. Jeong-soo had handed him a weapon. Ji-hwan had used it on his own marriage without knowing he was holding it. He stood in the penthouse kitchen and picked up her wedding ring from the marble counter and held it in his palm. He had been a man who crossed 3 states for peach pie. He had become a man whose wife packed a suitcase at midnight without waking him. Closed his hand around the ring. Do-yun confirmed her location 4 days later, a coastal town in Maine called Bellwether Cove. Staying with a retired woman named Odessa Langley, a name Ji-hwan recognized as someone connected to Imani's late mother. No security detail, no surveillance. A small town where the main industry was lobster, and the library was under renovation. She's working, Do-yun said, setting a thin folder on the desk. Ji-hwan looked up. What? The library restoration. She's been consulting with the local contractor. Daily, apparently. She's been drawing. He paused. Apparently, the contractor asked for a second opinion on the window placement, and she came back the next morning with a full structural proposal. Ji-hwan looked at him for a moment. She was always the best in any room she was in, he said. Came out quieter than he intended. Do-yun said nothing. Prepare the car, Ji-hwan said. Do-yun paused fractionally. Security detail, you'll want at least. No, Ji-hwan. I said no, he stood up. No detail, no advance team. Nothing. He looked at Do-yun steadily. This is not a retrieval. I'm not going up there to bring her back. Do-yun looked at him with the long-practiced expression of a man processing, a decision that was not his to make. Then what are you going up there for? Ji-hwan picked up the ring from the desk where it had sat for 4 days. He slid it into his jacket pocket. To tell her she was right, he said. Meanwhile, in Bellwether Cove, Imani Bellrose had been sleeping through the night for the first time in 2 years. This surprised her. She had expected Maine in early winter to feel like exile gray water, early dark, the specific loneliness of a new place when you are already carrying an old one. But Odessa's house was warm in the way of houses, occupied by someone who understood comfort as serious domestic commitment, thick quilts, real food cooked at actual mealtimes, plants in every window, and an enormous gray cat named Albert, who had decided on Imani's second night to sleep across her feet and had not revisited this decision. Odessa herself did not ask many questions. This was either instinctive or deliberate with Odessa. It was sometimes difficult to distinguish between the two, and what she offered instead was the particular gift of treating Imani like a competent adult who had arrived at a set of circumstances through her own reasoning and did not require an explanation demanded of her. She made sure Imani ate. She drove her to the only OB/GYN within 40 miles for a prenatal appointment without comment. She pointed out where the walking paths were and told her the tides so she didn't get caught on the rocks. She did not ask about Ji-hwan, not once, in 11 days. The library was the unexpected part. It was a 19th century building, 2 blocks from the waterfront, mid-renovation, with a contractor named Gary Ferris, who was 60 years old and deeply competent and harbored a specific anxiety about the east-facing window proportions that he could not articulate precisely but couldn't let go of. He had mentioned it to Odessa at the hardware store. Odessa had mentioned it to Imani at dinner. Imani had said she'd take a look. She walked over the next morning with her coffee. She stood in front of the building for about 4 minutes. Then she went inside and found Gary and said, "You're right about the windows. They're too small for the orientation. The morning light is going to miss the reading floor entirely by 9 o'clock for 6 months of the year." Gary stared at her. "That's exactly what's bothering me. You want to push them 18 inches toward the southwest corner and add a clerestory band along the north wall. It'll cost you about $1,200 in extra framing, but you'll get light from 3 directions instead of 1. Gary continued staring at her. "Are you an architect?" "I am," Imani said. "I'm also apparently unemployed and staying next door for the foreseeable future, so if you want, I can draw it out for you this afternoon." She drew it out that afternoon. Then she came back the next day and drew out 3 more problems Gary hadn't named yet. By the end of the week, she was on site every morning, graphite on her fingers, talking about load-bearing relationships and natural light, the way other people talked about weather with the fluency of someone for whom this was not professional performance but genuine thought. A sound like green wood splitting, she had forgotten what it felt like to be good at something in front of people who could see her being good at it. She had forgotten how much she had needed that. The baby was 13 weeks along. She had a photo from the ultrasound folded in her sketchbook. At night, lying in Odessa's guest room with Albert across her feet, she would take it out and hold it and feel the strange, overwhelming simultaneity of knowing she had made the right decision and knowing that the decision had cost her something enormous. She had not stopped loving Ji-hwan. This was the part that nobody prepared you for, the way love did not simply dissolve when the situation that had broken you became intolerable. It persisted. It sat in your chest like a coal, not burning but not cold, occupying space and radiating something that was not warmth exactly, but was not nothing either. She had not stopped loving him. She had simply decided that loving someone was not enough justification for losing yourself to them. One evening, sitting on the library steps, as the light went flat over the water, Gary came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her. "You don't have to answer this," he said. "Then maybe don't ask it," she said. He laughed, handed her the coffee. "Fair." They sat for a while without talking. "I'm going to have a baby," she said eventually, because she had not said it out loud to anyone except Tessa and the doctor, and the words needed to exist in the open air somewhere. In about 6 months. Gary looked at her, not with the telescoped, invasive interest of someone calculating the story behind the statement, but with the straightforward acknowledgement of a person receiving information. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Is the father?" He stopped. "Sorry, complicated," she said. "Right." The water moved below them. Something in her chest settled fractionally. "I left," she said. "The situation wasn't survivable the way it was. So I left." "Seems like a person who can do that, can do most things," Gary said. She considered this. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me in 6 months." She was still considering it. 4 days later, on a gray Tuesday morning, when Odessa called to her from the front of the house. Imani was upstairs in the guest room with her sketchbook, and Albert and the prenatal vitamins she was still negotiating with every morning. She heard the front door open. She heard Odessa's voice say something she couldn't quite make out. Then she heard a voice she would know anywhere, at any volume, in any room. She set down the sketchbook. Albert looked at the door. Her hand pressed flat against her stomach, not deliberately, not as a gesture, just the reflexive, protective movement of a body that had been carrying something precious for 13 weeks and knew exactly where the threat came from. Odessa appeared in the doorway. "There's someone on the porch," she said. Her voice was carefully neutral in the specific way that told Imani she had already assessed the situation and made a judgment about it and was presenting information rather than advice. "He came alone. No car that I can see. She paused like a man who hasn't slept in 4 days. Imani looked at the doorway for a long moment. "Did he say anything?" "He said he was looking for you." Odessa paused. "Then he said to tell you he's not here to take you anywhere." Imani sat very still. Then she stood up and walked to the window and looked down at the front porch. Ji-hwan was standing below in a dark coat, hands at his sides, looking at the street and not at the house. He was not in a suit. He looked diminished in a way she had never seen him look, not broken, not defeated, but stripped somehow, standing in the salt wind of a small Maine town with no security and no authority and no context that gave him any particular power at all. Just a man on a porch, waiting to see if a door would open. Imani looked at him for a full minute. Then she looked at Odessa. "Tell him I'll be down in a minute," she said. A sound greenwood splitting, and the point she had reached, the point past which there was no going back to the version of herself that had packed quietly and left a ring on a counter and walked out of an elevator into a new life, that point. Held completely, even as she walked toward the stairs. She had not softened. She had not reversed. She had not decided anything. But she walked downstairs, and that was already something neither of them had expected. She opened the door herself. Odessa had offered quietly. In that way she had of making offers feel like ordinary things. But Imani shook her head and came to the stairs alone, and crossed the small entryway, and put her hand on the doorknob and stood there. For approximately 3 seconds before she turned it. Ji-hwan was still facing the street when the door opened. He turned around slowly, not with the controlled precision he used in boardrooms or the careful positioning he used when entering rooms that might be hostile. He turned around the way tired people turn, without strategy, without preparation, just turning because the sound required it. He looked worse than she had thought from the window. Not physically damaged, but worn in a deeper way. The kind of worn that comes from inside, from days of the particular exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with what your mind refuses to put down. They looked at each other across the width of the porch. Neither of them said anything for what felt like a long time. "You look terrible," Imani said finally. "I know," Ji-hwan said. "How did you find me?" "Do-yun." She nodded. She had expected this. She wasn't angry about it. She had known the moment she reached Maine that he would find her eventually, that the resources available to him made genuine disappearance a temporary condition at best. She had not been hiding. She had been building distance, which was different. "Come in or don't," she said. "It's cold." She turned and walked back into the house. He came in. Odessa was in the kitchen making tea with the focused efficiency of a woman who understood that the most useful thing she could do in the next hour was provide hot liquid and absolute privacy. She acknowledged Ji-hwan with a single direct look when he came through the door, the look of a woman's assessing whether a person constituted a problem, and whatever she concluded, she said, "Only sit anywhere," and turned back to the stove. Imani sat at the kitchen table. Ji-hwan sat across from her, and the distance between them, across that table, 4 feet of pine wood, a ceramic sugar bowl, the morning newspaper, felt like something that had physical weight. He did not look around the house. He did not make observations about it. He looked at her. "I know about Gyeongsu," he said. "What he did to your schedule, the invitations, the calendar. All of it." Imani's expression did not change significantly. "How long have you known?" "Do-yun brought it to me the morning after I found your note." How long did Do-yun know? A pause that lasted precisely long enough to be its own answer. He was still confirming. Her voice was not heated. It was flat in a way that was considerably more serious than heat. How long? He thinks he's noticing consistencies about 6 weeks ago. Imani sat back in her chair. 6 weeks. Do-yun had been noticing inconsistencies for 6 weeks, which meant that for 6 weeks there had been enough visible evidence of deliberate interference in her life that a man trained to identify threats had identified it as one, and in those 6 weeks the information had not reached her, or Ji-hwan, or produced any material change in the conditions she was living inside. 6 weeks, she said. He wanted to be certain before. Ji-hwan, she stopped him. Not rudely, just stopped him. I understand why Do-yun waited. That's how you've all trained yourselves to operate confirm before you act. Don't move until you have the full picture. I understand the logic. She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking about Do-yun. He was quiet. I'm asking about you, she said. Because Do-yun knew for 6 weeks, but Gyeong-soo ran that operation for 8 months. 8 months of redirected invitations and engineered absences, and me sitting across dinner tables in our own home, wondering why I kept feeling like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. She kept her voice even because she had decided, coming down the stairs, that she was not going to perform grief for him. She was going to say what was true. What did you notice? In 8 months. What did you actually notice? Ji-hwan looked at his hands on the table. Not enough, he said. Nothing, Imani said. You noticed nothing. And I need you to understand the difference between those two answers, because one of them is the honest one. He looked up at her. Nothing, he said. You're right. I noticed nothing. Odessa set 2 cups of tea on the table and removed herself from the room with the quiet competence of someone who had spent decades in hospitals learning to give people privacy in impossible moments. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. Imani knew the duration because the kitchen clock was directly in her line of sight, and she found herself checking it, not from impatience, but from the need to anchor herself to something concrete, while they moved through territory that had no clean edges. Ji-hwan talked about Gyeong-soo's removal. She listened without interrupting. He talked about the financial dismantling, the revocation of access, the lieutenants being identified. She listened to all of it with the steady attention of someone receiving a report on events that are relevant but not central. You handled it, she said when he finished. Yes. And that felt like doing something. He looked at her. It was doing something. He manipulated her. It was cleaning up a mess, Imani said. Not unkindly, precisely. It was correct and it was necessary, and it doesn't change what the mess was made of. She wrapped both hands around her tea. Gyeong-soo found a gap, Ji-hwan. He didn't create it. He found it and worked it. And it worked, because the gap was already there. She looked at him. You were already gone, long before he touched the calendar. Ji-hwan sat with this. He didn't try to argue it or qualify it. He sat with it, the way a man sits with a thing he has known in some compartmentalized part of himself for a long time, and has now had moved into the open where it must be looked at directly. I know, he said. I tried to tell you about the baby 4 times, Imani said. 4 separate occasions over 2 weeks. Each time, something interrupted it. 3 of those times, the thing that interrupted was you. She watched his face. Not a phone call. Not a crisis. You. You were present in the room and unreachable at the same time. And I would get as far as taking a breath to say the words. A sound like green split, and then something in the way you were sitting, or holding your phone, or already looking toward the door, would make me understand that this was not going to land anywhere, and I would put the words back. His jaw tightened, not in anger, in recognition. 4 times, he said. The night of the gala was the 5th. She looked out the window at the gray water at the end of the street. When you said later, I want you to know that I know you didn't say it with cruelty. You said it because that's what you've become. A man who says later to the things that don't have deadlines. She looked back at him. I couldn't put a deadline on telling you I was pregnant. I shouldn't have had to. Ji-hwan reached into his jacket pocket and placed her wedding ring on the table between them. He had carried it. She could tell it was not cold, the way objects that have been stored become cold. It had the warmth of something kept close to a body. He did not push it toward her. He did not ask her to take it. He placed it on the table and left it there. I've been carrying it since the morning I found it, he said. I'm not giving it back to you. I'm not asking you to put it on. He stopped. Tried again. I didn't want it in a drawer somewhere. Imani looked at the ring on the table for a moment. Then she looked at him. I'm 12 weeks pregnant, she said. And for the past 4 weeks, since I've been here, I've slept through the night every night. For the first time in 2 years, she let this land. You need to understand what that means. Your absence has been more restful for me than your presence. That is where we are. Something moved across Ji-hwan's face that she had almost never seen there. Not grief. Something more exposed than grief. Shame. The particular shame of a person who has caused damage they cannot argue their way around because it's measured in things as simple and irreducible as sleep. He stayed in Bellwether Cove. This was the decision nobody expected, including Imani. She had expected him to make his case and then retreat to return to Manhattan with the understanding that something had been communicated, that the formal process of attempting reconciliation was now underway, that meetings would be scheduled and gestures would be calibrated, and the machinery of his considerable resources would be applied to the problem of his marriage. Instead, he asked Odessa if there was somewhere he could stay. Odessa looked at him for a long time. Then she said there was a shed out back that her late husband had used as a workshop. There was a cot in it. There was no heating unit, but there were blankets. It was 40 degrees at night. That works, Ji-hwan said. Odessa looked at Imani. Imani said nothing, which Odessa understood as permission of some kind, and went to find the extra blankets. Ji-hwan showed up at the library site the next morning. Imani was already there, standing with Gary over a section of the north wall where water damage had revealed a structural problem beneath the original plasterwork. She heard boots on the temporary plywood flooring and turned to find Ji-hwan behind her, in work clothes that were clearly borrowed or recently purchased, holding a pair of work gloves. Gary looked at him. "Can you carry lumber?" Gary said. "Yes," Ji-hwan said. "Then make yourself useful," Gary said, and pointed toward the east wall, and that was the entirety of the onboarding process. Ji-hwan spent the morning moving lumber. Imani spent the morning not watching him, which was a full-time occupation in itself. 3 days into his presence in Bellwether Cove, something happened that neither of them had planned for. Imani came to the library at 7:30 in the morning to find Ji-hwan already there, alone, before Gary arrived, crouched in front of the north wall with a flashlight, examining the water damage she and Gary had identified the day before. He had a notepad in his hand. He had been writing measurements. She stood in the doorway watching him. He hadn't heard her come in. He was focused on the wall with the same quality of attention she had watched him give to shipping manifests and tactical problems and everything in his professional world that he considered genuinely important. And seeing that quality of attention directed at a damaged wall in a small-town library did something unexpected to her equilibrium. She had not seen him look at something ordinary, with complete attention in a very long time. He turned and saw her standing there. He didn't startle. He held up the notepad. "The damage runs further than Gary thinks," he said. "Another 4 feet at least, behind the plasterwork. I was measuring the exterior surface last night, and the moisture pattern suggests the source is a failed roof junction, not the window frame." Imani crossed the room and looked at what he had written. He had sketched a rough structural diagram. The measurements were precise. He had marked the moisture gradient with a series of small notations along the wall face. "You did this last night?" she said. "I couldn't sleep," he said. She looked at the sketch again. "The roof junction is on the north pitch. Gary can't get to it without scaffolding on the outside. I know. I priced the scaffolding rental this morning. It's less than what we'd spend pulling and replacing plaster if we don't fix the source." He had said she noticed. She chose not to address it. "Show Gary when he gets here," she said. She went to make coffee. She stood at the small folding table where they kept the coffee supplies and poured water into the kettle and stared at the wall and tried to locate how she felt about what had just happened. He had spent a night in a cold shed running measurements on a wall because he couldn't sleep, because the problem was there and he was constitutionally unable to leave a visible structural problem alone. And this small, specific, a sound performed thing, completely unperformed thing, was the most genuine evidence she had seen of the man he actually was beneath the architecture of power he had built around himself. She did not know what to do with it. She poured the coffee and brought him a cup. He took it with both hands. Thank you. Don't thank me for coffee, Ji-hwan. Okay, he said. They stood at the damaged wall together, not speaking, and outside the light came thin and cold off the Atlantic, and neither of them moved to fill the silence with something easier. 10 days after Ji-hwan arrived in Bellwether Cove, Do-yoon called. Ji-hwan was on the library roof with Gary when the phone rang. Actual work at that point, not performed effort, because the scaffolding had revealed that the roof damage was worse than even his nighttime measurements had suggested, and Gary had needed a second pair of hands, and Ji-hwan had provided them without being asked. He answered, standing on the pitch of the roof with a cold wind off the water, and the town spread out below him, small and ordinary, and nothing like any landscape his life had occupied for the past 15 years. Talk, he said. Do-yoon's voice was careful in the way it got when he was managing the delivery of information. We have a problem. Gyeong-su's removal has created movement in the organization. 3 of the Eastern captains are interpreting your absence as weakness. Choi Byum-sik has been meeting with 2 of the Vancouver directors, and the word we're getting is that he's making a case for a transition of authority. Ji-hwan was quiet for a moment. What's the timeline, he said. If he moves within 2 weeks. He wants to call an internal council meeting. Without you there, the procedural legitimacy of it is questionable, but not impossible. There's historical precedent if enough senior members support the action. Ji-hwan looked out over the water. And if I return, he said, then there's no movement. Your presence alone stops it. These men are tactical. They're reading absence as abdication. They're not wrong to read it that way. Historically, that's exactly what it's been. Who's behind Choi? We think Gyeong-su, Do-yoon said. Not directly. Through intermediaries. He still has relationships we haven't fully mapped, and he's using them. Ji-hwan closed his eyes for 1 second, then opened them. The same man who destroyed my marriage to protect the organization is now using its vulnerabilities because I left the organization to try to salvage the marriage, he said. Do-yoon said nothing because there was nothing to say. I'll call you in an hour, Ji-hwan said. He hung up. He came down from the roof. Gary was below, marking the damaged timber sections. He looked up when Ji-hwan descended the scaffolding, and something in Ji-hwan's face made him set down the marker. Everything okay? No, Ji-hwan said, which was so direct and unperformed that Gary blinked. Anything I can do? No, Ji-hwan said again, but thank you. He walked 2 blocks to Odessa's house, and he knocked on the kitchen door, and Imani answered, because Odessa was at the pharmacy. She looked at his face. Come in, she said. He came in and stood in the kitchen and told her exactly what Do-yoon had told him. Not a summary, not a curated version with the dangerous parts softened. The full account in the same language Do-yoon had used, including Gyeong-su's probable involvement and the timeline, and what his return would mean and what his continued absence would mean. He had never told her this much about organizational business before. Structurally, deliberately, he had kept her outside it for her protection. He had told himself, for her safety, though he understood now that it had also been for his convenience. Because explaining your world to someone requires you to see it through their eyes, and seeing the Mujin Syndicate through Imani's eyes was not something he had wanted to do. She listened to all of it. Then she said, What do you need from me? Question caught him. He looked at her. In 4 years of marriage, with crises far less significant than this, he had never once asked her that question. She had just asked it naturally in a kitchen, to the man who had spent a decade building an empire and 2 months slowly losing it. I need to know what you need, he said, before I decide anything. Imani studied him for a long moment. I need you to be honest with me, she said. Not strategic, honest. She sat down at the kitchen table. If you go back and crush this, whatever that looks like what happens after, you rebuild authority. The organization stabilizes. And then what? You come back here? You divide your time? You keep doing what you've been doing, but with better scheduling and fewer manufactured crises, because Gyeong-su is gone? Her voice was not accusatory. It was clinical in the way of someone who has decided that clarity matters more than comfort. Is that the life you're describing to me? Ji-hwan sat down across from her. He sat with the question for a real amount of time. Not performing thought, actually thinking. No, he said finally. Then tell me what you're actually considering, she said. He looked at her. Getting out. The kitchen was very quiet. Completely, she said. The legitimate businesses can be separated and run without me. The rest, he stopped. Then said the thing he had not said to anyone. Not to Do-hyun. Not to himself in any clean language. The rest needs to stop. Not transferred. Not handed off. Stopped. Imani looked at him for a long time. That's not a small thing, she said. No, that's everything you built. Yes, and the people who depend on it, the men, the operations. Some of them have legitimate roles they can continue inside a legitimate structure. Some of them will lose significant income. Some of them will be exposed to legal consequences they've been avoiding for years. He kept his eyes on her. I know what it costs. I'm not pretending it doesn't. Imani pressed her fingers flat against the table surface, so. If you go back, she said, and you do this, dismantle it rather than reclaim it, what does Choi Byum-suk do? He fights it. How hard, Ji-hwan said. Possibly very hard. These men have built their livelihoods inside this structure. Dismantling it threatens every one of them. Choi won't be alone, he paused. It could get ugly before it ends. Ugly meaning dangerous, she said. Potentially. Imani looked at him. Then she looked down at the table, at her own hands, and in the seconds that she was looking down, Ji-hwan watched something work through her face that he couldn't fully interpret, not fear, not refusal, but some deep private calculation happening behind her eyes. She raised her head. Go, she said. He looked at her. Finish it, she said. Not the power struggle. The whole thing. Finish it the way it should be finished, not the way it's easiest to finish. Her voice was steady. And when you're done, when it's actually done, not when you think it might be done, or when it's manageable enough to walk away from come back here and tell me. Imani, I'm not forgiving you, she said clearly. That's not what this is. I'm not asking you to do this for me. I'm telling you that if you're serious about what you just said, then the only version of you I am willing to consider having any future with is the one that finishes it completely. She met his eyes. Because my child is not growing up on the edges of what you're running. Not even the cleaned up version. Not even the version where you're good at keeping it separate. She laid it out as simply as breathing. All the way out. Or not at all. Ji-hwan looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, one nod. Not enthusiastic, not relieved. Splitting. The nod of a man accepting terms that are fair and will cost him nearly everything he has built, because the alternative has already cost him the only thing that actually mattered. He stood up. I'll be back, he said. I know, she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just truthfully, he went to the door. His hand was on the frame when she spoke again. Ji-hwan. He turned. She was still sitting at the table, both hands wrapped around the coffee cup. Odessa had left on the counter, and she looked at him with the steady, exhausted, absolutely clear gaze of a woman who had made her decision and was not going to be talked back from it by anything except his actions. Don't do it halfway, she said. I'll know. He looked at her. I know you will, he said. He walked out into the cold. The door closed behind him. And Imani sat in Odessa's kitchen and pressed one hand flat against her stomach and understood that the next chapter of her life, whatever it became, was entirely contingent on whether the man she had loved for 6 years was capable of becoming someone she had never yet seen. Not harder, not stronger, not more powerful, simply free. She did not know if he was capable of it. She was not certain. She was capable of waiting long enough to find out. But the baby moved, or she imagined it moved. Too early to be certain at 13 weeks, but there was something, a faint internal shift, a flutter too small to name with confidence. And she sat still and breathed and held on to the possibility that some things could be built from the beginning, even when everything standing before them had to come down first. Outside, a car started. The sound of it faded down the coastal road. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a reckoning. It was the silence of the room, and gone somewhere it could not be avoided, into the world where it would have to become either a transformation or a final ending, with nothing left in between. He drove back to New York through the night, not because there was a flight he'd missed or a schedule he was keeping, because sitting still in a car in the dark with nothing but road and headlights was the closest thing to thinking clearly that he had left, and he needed the hours before he arrived to be hours he could not be interrupted inside. Do-yun called at 11:30. Ji-hwan let it go to voicemail. Called back at midnight when he was somewhere in Connecticut with the highway almost empty and the tree line black against a sky that offered nothing. "Tell me where Choi is holding his meetings," Ji-hwan said. "The Meridian Annex on 48th. He's been using the conference facilities there for the past week. 3 meetings that we know of, 2 more we suspect. He's using my building to plan my removal." Yes. Ji-hwan felt something move through him that was not quite anger. Anger was loud and imprecise. This was quieter and had edges. "Who's with him?" Confirmed Woo Sang-min from the Vancouver operation, 2 of the Eastern Port directors, and Chairman Lim from the Singapore side. Do-yun paused. Lim's involvement changes the geometry. He has relationships with 3 of the neutral captains we were counting on staying out of it. "Lim has been quiet for 2 years, Ji-hwan said. "Why now?" "'Cause Gyeong-soo called him," Do-yun said. "We intercepted a message 2 hours ago. Gyeong-soo told Lim that you've lost perspective." That main is a pause. That sound of Do-yun reading an old man chasing what he should have let go of. That the window for reorganization is open and closing. The highway passed beneath the car in a long gray ribbon. "He's not wrong about the window," Ji-hwan said. "Pull everything we have on Lim's Singapore accounts. All of it. Financial records, the shell company structure, the port authority relationships he's been paying to maintain." He thought for 3 seconds. "And get Sira on the phone tonight." Another pause from Do-yun. "Sarah, yes. Ji-hwan, given Imani's..." Do-yun. His voice stayed flat. "Get her on the phone." Yoon Sarah answered on the first ring, which told him she had been expecting the call. She was 36, had worked as Ji-hwan's public affairs director for 4 years, and had spent the last several weeks in the specific uncomfortable position of a woman who understands she has been used as a prop in someone else's play without having written herself into the script. She had known about Gyeong-soo's arrangement for approximately 3 months. He had approached her directly, framed it as organizational necessity, told her that her proximity to Ji-hwan in public settings served everyone's interests. She had not refused loudly enough or early enough, and that failure had weight she was still carrying. "I wondered when you'd call," she said. "I need your cooperation," Ji-hwan said. "Not a deposition, not a formal statement. I need you to walk me through every meeting Gyeong-soo had with you about Imani. Every conversation, what he asked, what you agreed to, what you actually did versus what he wanted. A silence on the line. And in return? In return, I tell the truth when anyone asks whether you were coerced. Because you were. I know that. Gyeong-soo doesn't offer things, he presents arrangements in language that makes refusal feel like a mistake you'll spend years paying for." His voice didn't change. "You were played. I'm not holding you responsible for the role he put you in. I'm holding you responsible for what you do from here." Another silence. Longer. "There's a meeting tomorrow morning," Sira said. Choi called it. "He wants me there to help frame the public-facing narrative of a leadership transition. He wants a statement ready for the business press within 48 hours of the council vote." Ji-hwan's hands on the wheel didn't move. "He's already written the vote," Ji-hwan said. "He thinks so," Sera said. "He has Lim, he has Woo. He has the 2 port directors, and he thinks he has 2 of the neutrals." She paused. "He doesn't have me. I just hadn't told him that yet." "You're going to that meeting tomorrow," Ji-hwan said. "You're going to sit in that room and listen to everything that's said. And then you're going to send Do-yun a complete account. And then I'm going to end this in a way that doesn't require anyone to be carried out of a room," Ji-hwan said. "But I need the full picture first, Imani," Sera said suddenly. Ji-hwan was quiet. "I want her to know," Sera said. "Not through you. Not in a message. I want to tell her myself what I did and didn't do. What I allowed and what I should have refused." Her voice was not asking for absolution. It had the specific texture of someone who was done managing their own culpability from a safe distance. "Can you arrange that?" "If she agrees to it," Ji-hwan said. "It's not my arrangement to make." "Fair," Sera said. He said. Everything. He hung up. The New York skyline appeared at the edge of the horizon, the familiar blaze of it, the scale that had, for 20 years, felt like power made visible. He looked at it and felt something he hadn't expected. Nothing. Not contempt, not nostalgia, not the particular proprietary feeling of a man approaching his territory. Just the lights of a city doing what cities do at midnight, indifferent and enormous and entirely uninterested in who arrived or departed. He reached the penthouse at 1:15 in the morning. The silence of it was different now. Before Imani left, the silence had been ordinary, the silence of a life running on parallel tracks that rarely intersected. Now it was archaeological. He moved through rooms that still held evidence of her. In the negative space, the reading chair angled slightly toward the window, the way she'd always positioned it. The exact height of the kitchen shelves where her cookbooks had been, now occupied by the books she'd left because they were heavy and she'd packed light. He did not sleep. He sat at the desk in his office and went through Do-yoon's files on Lim's Singapore operation with the focused, sleepless attention of a man who understands that what he does in the next 12 hours will determine whether what he promised in the main kitchen becomes real or becomes another version of later. By 4 in the morning, he had what he needed. The meeting on 48th Street began at 9. Ji-hwan arrived at 8:45. He walked through the lobby of his own building and took the elevator to the 27th floor and entered the conference room 8 minutes before Choi's meeting was scheduled to start, and the 3 men already seated at the table. 2 port directors and an associate of Wu's had the specific experience of watching a door open and finding behind it the exact person whose absence they had been in the process of capitalizing on. Nobody spoke for approximately 4 seconds. Then Ji-hwan sat down at the head of the table. "We'll wait for the others," he said. They waited. Choi Byung-suk arrived at 9:03, came through the door, talking to someone behind him on his phone, turned into the room, and stopped so completely that the person he was talking to said hello twice into the silence before Choi remembered to lower the phone. He was 53, broad-shouldered, a sound like green wood splitting, with the particular physical presence of a man who had navigated power structures through a combination of tactical intelligence and the willingness to be physically imposing when tactical intelligence wasn't enough. He looked at Ji-hwan at the head of the table, and his face did the thing faces do when the situation they have prepared for turns out to be entirely different from what they find. A rapid, visible recalculation behind the eyes. Woo Sang-min came in behind him and stopped just as abruptly. Sira was not there. She had done her part the night before and removed herself, which was correct. Lim arrived from Singapore by video connection, his face appearing on the screen at the far end of the room at 9:07, and when his eyes found Ji-hwan, the connection lagged for 1 moment, as if even the technology was uncertain how to process the situation. "Gentlemen," Ji-hwan said, "sit down." They sat. Not because they wanted to, because the specific cold, absolute authority in his voice had not diminished in the weeks he'd spent in Maine, and the bodies of men who have operated under that authority for years respond to it before the mind catches up. "I understand there was an agenda for this morning," Ji-hwan said. He looked at each of them in turn, Choi, Woo, the port directors, Lim's face on the screen. "I'm going to simplify it." He placed a folder on the table. "Lim," he said, not looking at the screen, "your Singapore accounts. The 3 shell structures you've been running through the Meridian Logistics chain. The Port Authority relationship, specifically Director Tan, who has been receiving payments routed through a subsidiary of your shipping arm since 2019. He tapped the folder. "All of it is documented. The documentation is currently in the possession of Do-yun and 2 attorneys, one of whom has a standing relationship with the Monetary Authority of Singapore." He paused. "It will remain in their possession, unsubmit, unless I have a reason to submit it." Lim's face on the screen had gone very still, Ji-hwan said. "The Vancouver situation from last month, the one that required my personal presence to resolve." He looked at Wu directly. "It didn't require my personal presence. It required your cover story. The cargo discrepancy you reported was manufactured. I know this because I had the terminal records independently audited 3 days ago. You created a crisis to pull me away from New York for 5 days, at a specific moment." He let this sit. That was Gyong-su's request, I assume. Wu said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. Choi. Ji-hwan finally looked at him directly. You've been in this organization for 19 years. You know how this works. You know what happens when a move like the one you've been planning fails. He kept his voice even. No performance of menace, none was needed. I'm not going to do what you're expecting me to do. I'm not going to make an example of you or remove you the way I removed Gyong-su. I'm going to do something that will frighten you considerably more. Choi's jaw was tight. And what is that? I'm going to tell you the truth, Ji-hwan said. About what's happening. About what I'm planning. And then I'm going to give you a choice that Gyong-su never gave anyone, because he didn't believe people with choices could be controlled. He looked around the table. All of you. The room was absolutely still. I'm dismantling Mujin, Ji-hwan said. Not reorganizing it. Not restructuring it under new leadership. Dismantling it. The criminal operations end. The financial networks are separated and submitted to legal review. The dirty infrastructure, the port relationships, the cargo manipulation, the account structures, all of it goes through a negotiated legal process rather than through a transition to another generation. He let them have a moment with this. The legitimate businesses, Quan Meridian's shipping and logistics operations, survive under professional management. Those of you with legitimate roles in those operations can continue in them. The income will be less. The risk will be considerably less as well. He looked at each of them. The alternative is that I submit what I have to the relevant authorities in each of your jurisdictions and let the legal process do what it's designed to do. I'm accepting significant personal, legal, and financial consequences from this process. I'm not asking you to accept less than I'm accepting myself. Choi leaned forward. You can't dismantle 20 years of... I can, Ji-hwan said. And I will. The only question is whether each of you participates in the process or becomes part of what I submit. This is... Choi stopped. Started again. You're destroying everything because of a woman who left you. The room tightened. Ji-hwan looked at Choi for a long moment. I'm fixing everything. Because of a woman who was right to leave me, he said. There's a significant difference. Choi pushed back from the table. I won't be part of this. Then sit down and tell me exactly how you want to be part of the alternative, Ji-hwan said Zid. Because walking out of this room doesn't change what's in that folder. Choi stood with his hands on the table, his breathing visible, the calculation happening in real time. Behind his eyes, the calculation of a man who has built his inside a structure that is being deconstructed beneath him and has to decide in the next 30 seconds whether to fight the demolition or find stable ground within it. He sat down. Not surrender, not agreement, but the recognition that the room had changed in a way he could not change back and that his options were narrowing faster than he could run through them. Lim spoke from the screen. His voice was careful. The Singapore accounts. If I cooperate with the legal process, full cooperation, documentation. The structured settlement you're describing, what's the exposure? Civil primarily, Ji-hwan said, some regulatory. Criminal exposure depends on the depth of cooperation. My legal team has run the scenarios. He looked at the screen. Gyong-su's removal left a vacuum. You moved into it because it looked like opportunity. That's rational. The documents I have can be used as leverage or as a path, depending on what you decide in the next 20 minutes. Wu said quietly, the Vancouver men, the crew there, the ones who don't have legitimate roles in the shipping operation. What happens to them? Severance, real severance. Not a message and a handshake. I'm setting aside a fund from the asset liquidation. 6 months minimum for every man who's been in the organization more than 3 years. Longer for the senior crew. He paused. I'm not walking away from responsibilities. I'm restructuring them. Wu looked at his hands. Looked up. I'll need to see that in writing. You'll have it by end of business today, Ji-hwan said. The meeting lasted 2 more hours. By the end of it, Lim had agreed to full cooperation. Wu had agreed conditionally, pending written terms. The 2 port directors had said very little, but had not left the room, which was its own kind of answer. Choi sat through the second hour in a silence that was not agreement, but was no longer active resistance, the silence of a man recalculating his position in a landscape that no longer resembled the one he'd planned to operate in. When the room finally emptied, Do-yun closed the door and stood against it and looked at Ji-hwan. "Jeong-soo," Do-yun said. "He'll hear about this within the hour," Ji-hwan said. "Let him. And when he reacts, he'll go to whoever he thinks is still movable. He has fewer options than he realizes. Most of them were in this room." Ji-hwan gathered the folder. "Monitor him. Don't touch him. He's not a threat anymore. He's just a man watching something he built get taken apart, and there's nothing in his toolkit for that situation." Do-yun nodded slowly. "The legal team needs you this afternoon." "I know." Ji-hwan stood. "Do-yun." "Yes. The financial settlement for the dismantling the legitimate operations, the severance fund, the legal fees, it's going to take most of what I have. Personally and organizationally." He looked at Do-yun steadily. "I need you to know that going in. Because you're part of this organization and what I'm doing affects you." Do-yun looked at him for a moment. "What's my role in the new structure?" "Whatever you want it to be," Ji-hwan said. "The logistics company needs a real operations director. The salary is less than what you're making now. The risk is," he almost said nothing, but that was the wrong word, "manageable." Do-yun was quiet for a moment. "I'll take the operations role," he said. "You don't have to decide now." "I already decided," Do-yun said. 11 years ago, when you were the kind of man worth following. I've been waiting for you to be that man again." He paused. "Maine apparently did something to you." "Maine had good lumber and bad heating," Ji-hwan said. Do-yun almost smiled. "I'll set up the legal meeting." Sarah came to the office at 4 in the afternoon. She sat across from Ji-hwan and laid out every conversation with Gyeong-soo, every positioning at public events, every manufactured proximity she had allowed to stand without correction. She was precise and unemotional and thorough in a way that cost her something visible around the eyes. When she finished, she said, "I want to resign." "I know," Ji-hwan said. "I'd like to do it in a way that doesn't look like I'm running," she said. "Formally, with a transition period, whatever the company needs." 2 weeks, Ji-hwan said. "Then we announce the restructuring, and your departure is part of a broader organizational change." "It's the truth." "And Imani?" Sarah said. Ji-hwan looked at her. "She gets to decide if she wants to hear from you." "I'm not making that choice for her." Sarah nodded. She gathered her bag. At the door, she stopped. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think she left because she's the most structurally sound person in any room she occupies, and she knew the load-bearing walls were finishing before anyone else did." She paused. "She's a good architect." "Yes," Ji-hwan said, "she is." Gyeong-soo called at 7:15 that evening. Ji-hwan answered on the third ring. "You've lost your mind," Gyeong-soo said. His voice was not the voice of the boardroom anymore. The control was still there, but stretched thin over something that was shaking underneath it. 20 years. 20 years of building something real, something with reach and permanence, and you're surrendering it to a legal process because a woman— "Say her name like that one more time," Ji-hwan said. A silence. "What you built," Ji-hwan said, "required men like me to stop being people. Required us to make our personal lives small and manageable and secondary to the organization's needs. You sold that as strength for 20 years and I bought it. And what it cost me is currently 13 weeks pregnant in Maine, and I am done paying that price." His voice didn't rise. It was the flattest, most final tone he owned. "The organization is coming down. If you have documentation in your personal possession that is relevant to the legal settlement, I just strongly suggest you engage an attorney before the end of this week. Because what I'm submitting to the relevant authorities is comprehensive, and the more complete your cooperation, the better the outcome for you." Gyeong-soo said nothing for a moment. "Then you're throwing away everything I built you to be." "I know," Ji-hwan said. "That's the point." He ended the call. He sat in the empty office for a moment, in the silence that followed, and felt the full weight of what was in motion: the legal machinery, the financial dismantling, the organizational structure coming apart at every seam, the 2 decades of carefully constructed power dissolving into something ordinary and manageable and survivable. He felt it all, and beneath it, steady and clear and surprisingly solid, something he had not felt in years. Not relief exactly. Not yet. Relief required the thing to be finished, and nothing was finished. But the sensation of a man who has finally stopped carrying something he picked up so long ago, he'd forgotten it wasn't part of his body. He picked up his phone. He called the number he'd been building toward calling for 3 days. It rang twice, Imani answered. "It's happening," he said. Her voice on the phone was quiet and careful. "Are you okay?" The question was simple and direct, and she asked it without heat, without strategy, without anything behind it except the genuine wanting to know of a woman who, despite everything, had not stopped caring whether the answer was yes or no. He had not been asked that question in a way that required an honest answer for longer than he could accurately measure. "Not yet," he said, "but I think I'm going to be." She was quiet for a moment. "How long?" she said. "Weeks." "The legal process," he stopped. "I don't want to give you a timeline I can't keep." "Don't," she said. "Just tell me when it's done, I will." Another silence, not uncomfortable, not warm exactly. The silence of two people standing at the edge of something that has not yet resolved itself and knowing that the resolution is real, but not yet reachable. "The baby moved today," Imani said. Ji-hwan stopped breathing for approximately 1 second. "Actually moved?" he said. "I think so. 14 weeks tomorrow." "It's early, but..." She paused. It felt like something real. He sat with this for a moment that was completely outside the framework of everything else happening in his life. The legal filings, the organizational dismantling, the men in rooms recalculating, the entire architecture of 20 years coming down around him. Just this. A flutter at 14 weeks. A life in a house in Maine that he had not yet held and did not yet know and was responsible for in a way that had nothing to do with power or money or protection. "Imani," he said. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm going to finish this." "I know," she said again. He believed she believed him. He was not certain he deserved it. He closed his eyes briefly in the empty office, in the building that would begin the legal process of being restructured away from everything it had been, in the city that made him and that he was now in the process of leaving behind in the only way that mattered. And somewhere in Maine, 14 weeks along, something moved that had not yet decided who it was going to be, but that would grow up, one way or another, into the consequence of every choice being made in this room tonight. Ji-hwan opened his eyes. He picked up the legal brief from the corner of his desk. He opened it to the first page, and he began. The legal process was not clean. Ji-hwan had known it would not be clean. He had spent enough years operating inside complex organizational structures to understand that dismantling one was never a matter of a single decision followed by orderly execution. It was going to be contested and expensive and humiliating in ways he could not fully anticipate in advance. And the humiliation was going to be the most useful part of it because humiliation, properly received, had a way of burning away the last remaining illusions about who you actually were. What he had not anticipated was how physical it would feel. The first attorney meeting lasted 6 hours. Sat in a conference room on Lexington Avenue with 3 lawyers who specialized in organizational restructuring and regulatory compliance, and they laid out the landscape of what he had built with the specific, unsentimental precision of people who were being paid to understand it rather than to judge it, and listening to it described in their language, in the language of financial instruments and regulatory exposure and jurisdictional complexity, was the experience of seeing something through glass that you had previously only ever seen from the inside. What they described was real. It had existed. He had built it and maintained it and defended it for 20 years and called it, in various internal formulations, an empire, an organization, a structure, responsibility. What 3 attorneys on Lexington Avenue called it was considerably more specific and considerably less flattering, and sitting in that room for 6 hours, listening to the precise language of what he had made, was the most sustained discomfort he had experienced since Imani left. He did not minimize it or redirect it or find the tactical angle that would make it manageable. He sat in the room and let it be what it was. The lead attorney, a woman named Carol Prescott, who had been doing this work for 25 years and whose face revealed approximately nothing about her personal opinions on the clients she represented, laid out the financial settlement structure on the 3rd day. The numbers were significant. The personal cost, after the organizational asset liquidation and the legal fees and the negotiated regulatory penalties, was going to leave him with a fraction of what he had entered this process with. Not destitute, he was too financially sophisticated to have built a structure without legitimate preserved assets, but diminished in a way that was measurable and irreversible, and required no further discussion. He signed the settlement framework on the fourth day. Carol Prescott looked at him across the table when the signing was finished and said, without inflection, most clients in your position negotiate harder for personal financial preservation. I know, Ji-hwan said. You left approximately $3 million on the table. I know that too, he said. She looked at him for a moment with the careful, neutral face of a woman who had decided this was not her business. All right, she said, and moved to the next document. Choi Byum-suk's cooperation came at the end of the second week, as predicted, and arrived with the specific texture of a man who has spent 14 days exhausting every alternative before accepting the one he was always going to accept. He called Ji-hwan directly. Ji-hwan answered on the second ring because he had been expecting the call and because making Choi wait would have been a performance of power he no longer had any interest in performing. Tell me the terms, Choi said. No preamble. The voice of a man who has burned through his opening positions and arrived at the only remaining conversation. Ji-hwan told him. Civil exposure, regulatory compliance, the severance structure for the operational crews, the timeline for asset transition. Clean and specific, no embellishment. Choi was quiet for a moment on the other end. Then he said, the men under Wu in Vancouver, the ones who have been doing dock work for 9 years. They're not getting absorbed into the legitimate operation. No, Ji-hwan said. The legitimate operation doesn't have positions for all of them. Then the severance needs to be longer than 6 months for the senior crew. Ji-hwan paused. What are you proposing? 12 months for anyone with more than 7 years in the organization, Choi said. And job placement assistance. Real assistance, not a phone number and a handshake. Someone who actually helps these men find legitimate work. Ji-hwan was quiet for a moment. He had not expected this from Choi. Cooperation, yes. Negotiated self-preservation, certainly. But this advocacy for men who had no leverage in the negotiation and from whom Choi owed nothing further was outside the model he had built for predicting Choi's behavior. 12 months and placement assistance, Ji-hwan said. Agreed, another silence. Then your wife, Choi said. The words came out with visible difficulty, as though they were being said against the resistance of everything he had been trained to value. She was right to leave. I want you to know I understand that. I didn't at the time. In that boardroom, I didn't understand it. I understand it now. Ji-hwan said nothing for a moment. I'll tell her you said so, Ji-hwan said, if she wants to hear it. She probably doesn't, Choi said. Probably not, Ji-hwan agreed. Call ended. Ji-hwan sat in the hotel room he had been staying in. For 2 weeks, he had not been back to the penthouse, which was in the process of being listed for sale as part of the asset liquidation, and looked at the wall for a moment. Then he picked up the legal brief and went back to work. Wu Sangmin came in person. This was not required. His attorney had been managing his cooperation remotely, with clean and efficient documentation, and there was no procedural reason for Wu to appear in the Lexington Avenue conference room in person on a Wednesday afternoon in week 7. He came anyway, without his attorney, which was either brave or foolish, and was possibly both. He was 51 years old, had been with the organization for 16 years, and had the specific physical quality of a man who had spent a long time being careful about what he said, careful about what he showed, careful about which version of himself was visible in which room. Carefulness was still there, but it was sitting differently on him today. Looser somehow, less load-bearing. I need to say something that isn't in the documents, he said when he sat down. Ji-hwan waited. The Vancouver manufacturing Wu said, Crisis I created to pull you away. I've been trying to find a way to frame it that makes it something other than what it was, and I can't. He put his hands flat on the table. Not a gesture of submission, just the gesture of someone who needs to feel something solid underneath him while he says a difficult thing. I knew what it was doing to your marriage. Gyeongsu didn't hide it from me. He told me directly that the objective was to keep you occupied and away from your wife. And I did it anyway, because I told myself it was organizational loyalty, and the organization was what I owed. Ji-hwan looked at him. I have a wife, Wu said. 22 years. She doesn't know what I do. She thinks I manage international freight logistics and that the hours are long because international freight logistics has long hours, which is partially true. He paused. I sat across from her at dinner the night after that boardroom meeting where Gyeongsu called your wife replaceable, and she asked me how my day was. I said fine, and we ate dinner. And I thought about absolutely none of it. He looked at Ji-hwan. I've been thinking about it since. Ji-hwan was quiet for a moment. What does your wife know about your work? He said. Almost nothing, Wu said. Tell her something true, Ji-hwan said. Not everything, but something true. You don't have to confess the architecture of it. But find one true thing and say it to her while she can still receive it. He paused. I waited too long to say true things to mine. Don't repeat my mistake. Wu looked at him for a long time. Is she all right? Wu said. Your wife? Ji-hwan thought about Imani in Maine, with graphite on her hand and a baby moving inside her and the Atlantic outside every window, drawing buildings that would let in light that had been blocked for decades. She's more than all right, he said. She's building something real. Good, Wu said, with a simplicity that contained more genuine relief than Ji-hwan had expected from him. He signed his documents and left, and Ji-hwan sat in the empty conference room after and remained still for a long moment, holding the specific weight of a conversation between two men who had both, in different ways and to different degrees, failed the people they were supposed to see, and who were both imperfectly and too late, and without adequate excuse, trying to understand what they had done. Lim Ji-hwan's Singapore process required 6 weeks and 3 regulatory bodies and the kind of procedural complexity that made Ji-hwan grateful for Carol Prescott's specific competence, because without it the process would have taken twice as long and cost twice as much and produced an outcome that was less clean. Lim cooperated. Not from conscience, Ji-hwan was clear-eyed about this, but from the accurate calculation that full cooperation produced better terms than partial cooperation, and that the documentation Ji-hwan's team had assembled left him with less room than he had initially believed. He accepted the terms. He signed. His attorneys confirmed the relevant transfers. His connection to the Mu-Jin organization ceased to exist in any operational or legal sense. He made no speech about it. Ji-hwan did not expect one. Some accountings were made in documents and not in words, and that was its own form of honesty. Gyeongsu's chapter closed without direct contact. His attorneys communicated through the appropriate channels. The documentation was submitted. The regulatory process moved forward with the impersonal efficiency of a legal system that does not require the personal participation of the man whose decisions created the situation in order to process the situation. Ji-hwan had thought, in the early weeks of the process, that there would be a final confrontation, that Gyeongsu would call or appear, or send some communication that was more than legal documentation, some acknowledgement of the specific human damage of what he had done, some recognition that the 8 months of manufactured absence had cost a woman something that could not be itemized in a settlement. It did not happen. Gyeongsu's architecture required him to maintain, to the end, the position that his choices had been justified by the logic he had always used. To engage directly with Ji-hwan about Imani would have been to admit that Imani was a consideration his logic had failed to account for adequately, and that admission was apparently not available to him. Ji-hwan came to peace with this in week 9, on a Tuesday morning when he was walking across Lexington Avenue between meetings and understood, standing on the street corner waiting for the light, that he was not going to receive from Han Gyeongsu the thing he had not known he was waiting for, and that the absence of it did not change anything that needed to be changed. What Gyeongsu owed, he owed to the legal process now. What Ji-hwan owed, he owed to Imani, and to the child whose face he had not yet seen. He crossed the street. He went to his meeting. He did not think about Gyeongsu again that day. The final document was signed on a Tuesday morning in late April. Ji-hwan had been awake since 4. which was not unusual for the past 11 weeks, and he arrived at the Lexington Avenue office at 8:15, 45 minutes before the scheduled signing, and sat in the reception area and sat Ingrid drinking bad coffee from the office machine and looking at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. New York at 8:15 in the morning was doing what it always did, operating at full volume, indifferent to the specific human dramas occurring in any given building along its length, rolling forward with the particular institutional momentum of a place that had been doing this for long enough to have stopped requiring individual permission from anyone inside it. He had loved this city. He still did, in a way that did not require him to remain inside it. Carol Prescott came to get him at 9. The signing took 40 minutes. Multiple documents, multiple signatures, the careful procedural choreography of a legal conclusion. He signed everything in front of him without hesitation and without negotiating for anything further. And when the final page was turned and witnessed and filed, Carol Prescott set down her pen and looked at him across the table. "It's complete," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the careful, neutral face she had maintained across 11 weeks of meetings. Then she said, unexpectedly, "Where are you going from here?" Ji-hwan looked at her. "Maine," he said. She nodded once. "Good," she said. He was not entirely sure what she meant by it and did not ask. He shook hands with the attorneys. He walked to the elevator. He pressed the lobby button and stood in the small enclosed space of the elevator car as it descended, and he looked at his own reflection in the brushed steel of the doors, and he looked like himself, the same face, the same posture, the same controlled physical economy he had carried for 41 years, and also somehow different. Not visibly, not in any way another person would necessarily identify, but different in the specific interior way of someone who has set down something they have been carrying for a very long time, and can now feel, in the absence of the weight, what the carrying had actually cost. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. He walked out into the April morning. He stood as the sidewalk. The city moved around him with its practiced indifference. He took a breath of air that smelled like exhaust and coffee and the particular metallic smell of a New York morning, and he took out his phone and called Imani. She answered on the second ring. "It's done," she said. The silence that followed was the most specific silence he had heard in 11 weeks. Not surprised she had believed he would do it, he knew that could tell it from the quality of her waiting, which had been the waiting of someone certain of the outcome rather than hoping for it. But the silence of a thing actually arrived at, after weeks of the thing being in process. "Legally done," she said, "all of it, signed 40 minutes ago. The dissolution is complete. Du-Yun has full operational authority over the logistics company. My personal settlement is finalized. I have no organizational role in anything that isn't legitimate." He paused. "It's done." She was quiet again, brief. "Then are you okay?" The question. Her question. The one she asked, because she actually wanted to know, not because it was the appropriate thing to ask in a moment like this, but because she was a person who, even through everything, still cared whether the answer was yes or no. "I'm lighter than I thought I'd be," he said. "I keep using that word." "I know," she said, "I've noticed." "Come back," she said. Not a request exactly. Not quite a command. The voice of a woman who has processed what she's heard and is ready for the next thing. "Gary says the library walkthrough needs you there. He has questions about the roof junction repair. You can't answer by phone." "Tell Gary I'll be there Saturday," Ji-hwan said. "I'll tell him." A pause. Shorter than the previous ones, Ji-hwan. "Yes, I'm glad it's done," she said. "Me too," he said. "Imani Saturday," she said, and ended the call. He stood on the sidewalk with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he started walking toward the parking garage. 7 hours to Maine. It felt like the correct direction. He arrived in Bellwether Cove on a Saturday evening when the late April light was doing its irrational, extended thing over the coastal water, hanging in the air, past the point where logic suggested it should have faded, turning the edges of buildings and the surface of the harbor to a color that existed somewhere between gold and gray, and had no name that fully captured it. He parked on the street outside Odessa's house and sat in the car for a moment. Not hesitating, just taking the measure of the place the way he had always taken the measure of any space before entering it, knowing the exits, knowing the light, knowing what he was walking into. What he was walking into was ordinary and specific and more real than anything he had entered in a very long time. He got out with his bag. Albert was on the porch railing, occupying it with the complete territorial conviction of a large gray cat who is determined that this surface belongs to him and is willing to allow temporary human use of the surrounding area. Ji-hwan knocked. Odessa opened the door and looked at him with the direct, assessing look she had applied. Every time she had seen him, the look of a woman who has spent decades determining whether people constitute problems, and whatever her current conclusion was, she opened the door wider and stepped back. "You look like a man who finished something," she said. "I did," he said. "Good," she said. "Come in. Supper's in 20 minutes. No ceremony, no extended welcome. Just the practical acknowledgement of a person arriving and the immediate orientation toward the next concrete thing." He had come to understand that this was Odessa's form of acceptance. The willingness to incorporate you into the existing domestic routine was the warmth. The supper, in 20 minutes, was the embrace. Came in. Imani was at the kitchen table. She looked up when he came through the door, and the look she gave him was the look he had been learning to receive over the past months. Direct, clear, not particularly softened by the circumstances, but not hard either. The look of a woman who has decided that honest seeing is more useful than managed seeing, and who applies it consistently to everything, including the person who had once been the most consistent source of her pain. She looked at his face. "You look like yourself," she said. "The earlier version. People keep saying that. It's because it's been a while since the earlier version was visible," she said. She looked back at the drawing she had in front of her on the table. "Sit down. Odessa's made enough food." He sat down. Amaya, 31 weeks along, making her presence felt in the way a third trimester pregnancy makes. Its presence felt, with authority and without much regard for the convenience of the person carrying it, shifted, and Imani adjusted slightly in her chair with the specific unconscious physical negotiation of a woman who has been having this conversation with her body for months. Ji-hwan watched this. She did not look up from her drawing. He poured himself water from the pitcher on the table and sat in the kitchen and felt the specific strangeness of ordinary things. A table, a drawing, a woman working, a glass of water, a house full of the sounds of a real and inhabited life. He had once sat at the center of an empire and had not understood that exactly this ordinary and unheroic and real domestic moment was the thing he had been starving for, without knowing what the hunger was for. The library dedication happened on a Wednesday morning, 17 days after he returned. The building had become, over the months of work, something that Gary described in his characteristic understated way as better than it had a right to be, which from Gary was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The east windows threw morning light across the reading floor, at the angle Imani had specified from the beginning. The clerestory band along the north wall caught the afternoon in a way that made the room feel larger than its square footage. The water damage had been addressed at the source rather than at the surface, which meant the repair would hold rather than merely appearing to hold, which Imani considered the minimum acceptable standard for any restoration. It was a good building, not a perfect building. The age showed in places, and some of the budget decisions left marks that a better-funded project would not have accepted, and the south wall had a slight bow that Gary had decided was within tolerance, and that Imani had agreed with while privately disagreeing about the definition of tolerance. But it worked. It did what a library was supposed to do, which was to be a place where the act of sitting with a book felt supported by the physical space around you, and that was not a small thing. The town came, not in the way of an audience assembled for a performance, but in the way of people who have a stake in a thing and show up because the stake is genuine. Patricia, the library director, gave a speech that ran 6 minutes over the planned time, which everyone accepted because Patricia had excellent taste in books and was known to be right about most things. Gary spoke briefly and specifically and mentioned Imani by name in a way that attributed credit rather than bestowed it. 3 of the restoration crew stood near the refreshments table and accepted congratulations with the slightly awkward grace of people whose work is their speech. Ji-hwan stood at the back. He had no role in this event. He had identified a roof junction and carried lumber and funded a scaffolding rental. These were contributions, but they were not the story of this building. And he understood clearly that the story of this building was Imani's the 18 inches of window repositioning, the clerestory band, the source repair rather than the surface repair, the decision to see what the building could be rather than merely what it needed to stop being. He watched her move through the room. She shook hands. She explained structural decisions to people who asked with the patient, genuine pleasure of someone who actually enjoys talking about why things work. She laughed at something Patricia said near the reference section. She touched the east wall and passing the automatic, unrehearsed contact of a person checking the integrity of something they built, and the gesture was so unconscious professional that it made his chest do something he was still learning the vocabulary for. She was entirely at home. He had spent 4 years bringing her into rooms where the measure of her success was how well she served the context he created, and he had watched her do it with grace and capability, and at a cost he had failed to see because he had been too absorbed in the context itself. What he was watching now was what she was when the context was her own. After the ceremony, she found him near the east windows. He had been standing there, watching the morning light do exactly what she had told him it would do, and she came across the room toward him with the specific walk of a woman who is 32 weeks pregnant and has made her peace with the mechanics of it. "You were right about the windows," he said. "I know," she said. "Then how does it feel, being on this side of it?" Everything finished. He considered the question honestly. "Strange," he said. "Not bad, but strange. Like I keep reaching for things that aren't there anymore and then realizing I don't need them." She looked at him. "What do you need?" The question was direct and without sentimentality. She asked it the way she asked structural questions because she wanted the honest answer, not the performed one. "To be useful," he said. "To be present. To not waste what's in front of me the way I wasted what I had before." He looked at her. "To be the kind of person you and Amaya can rely on." Not dramatically, just consistently. Imani held his gaze for a moment. "Consistently is the hard one," she said. "I know," he said. "It doesn't mean perfectly," she said. "I'm not asking for perfect. I had 4 years of you performing composure, and I have no desire to repeat the experience. I'm asking for honest." She looked at him steadily. "When you're struggling, say so. When something is pulling you back toward old habits, say so. Don't manage it silently and hope I don't notice, because I will notice, and what I'll notice won't be the struggle, it'll be the hiding." "Okay," he said. "And then I'm struggling with not working. The kind of constant high-stakes operational engagement I've done it for 20 years, and the absence of it is." He paused, finding the honest word. "Loud," he said. "The silence where it used to be is loud." Imani looked at him. "Then find something real to build," she said. "Not another organization. Not another power structure. Something with physical results you can see at the end of a day." She paused. "There's a community center project in Portland that my studio is being asked to consult on. Construction management side needs someone with operational experience and enough financial background to manage a budget that the previous contractor ran into the ground." She held his gaze. "It pays considerably less than what you're used to." "That's not a consideration," he said. "I know it's not," she said. "I'm telling you anyway, so you walk in with accurate expectations." He looked at her for a moment. "You're offering me a job." "I'm telling you a job exists," she said. "Whether you want it is your decision." The east windows held the morning light between them. "I want it," he said. She nodded once. "Don't be late on your first day," she said, and walked back toward Gary, who was trying to explain the clerestory band to 2 men from the Historical Preservation Committee who clearly did not understand what a clerestory was. The conversation they had been building toward happened 3 weeks later, on a Sunday evening, when the May light was long and blue, and the town was quiet in the specific way of Sunday evenings in small coastal places. Ji-hwan was in the shed. Imani knocked. She sat in the second chair, since the first time she came to the shed, which had remained without discussion as though its presence had been settled by the shed itself, and looked at him with the directness that was, he had come to understand, the deepest form of respect she knew how to offer. When Imani looked at you directly, she was telling you that you were worth the honesty. "I need to know what you're asking for," she said. Not in abstract terms. Specifically, "I want to stay," he said. In Maine, "I want to be present for Amaya consistently, from the beginning, without the gaps and absences that defined how I operated before. I want to be in your life in whatever form you determine is appropriate, and I want to earn back whatever ground I've lost through what I do, not through what I promise." He looked at her. "And I want to build the house." She was quiet for a moment. "The drawings," she said. "Yes. The ones I took the night I left." "Yes." She looked at the wall of the shed for a moment. Then she said, "I found land 3 months ago. A piece of coastal bluff 30 minutes from here. The site is solid. I had a geological assessment done in February. The access road needs work, but that's solvable." She looked back at him. "I've been sitting on it because I hadn't decided whether I was building for 1 or 2. The shed was quiet enough that he could hear the distant water. "Have you decided?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I still love you," she said. The words came out with the specific gravity of something that has been examined carefully and determined to be true, despite every reason it might not have survived. "I want you to understand that this isn't sentiment. It's not nostalgia for the beginning of us, and it's not the kind of love that requires its object to be other than what he actually is. It's a clear-eyed recognition that after everything, after the 4 years of erosion and the leaving and the 11 weeks of watching you dismantle what you built and rebuild yourself into something I can actually see clearly. I love the person I can see clearly." She paused. "That's not the same as trust. I want you to hold that distinction carefully." "I understand the distinction," he said. "Loving you doesn't mean I'm not watching," she said. "It doesn't mean I'll overlook the old patterns if they come back. It means I'm willing to be in the same room with you and see what develops, and that I'm bringing everything I am to whatever develops, and that I expect the same from you." "You'll have it," he said. "I know I will," she said. "'Cause I'll leave again if I don't." The directness of it should have been frightening. It wasn't. It was the most solid ground he had stood on in years, not because it was safe, but because it was honest. And he had been living on managed surfaces for so long that the experience of standing on something genuinely load-bearing was almost physical in its relief. "2," he said. "You're building for 2. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come look at the land tomorrow. Bring your structural instincts. I want to talk about foundation placement." "I'll be there," he said. 7 in the morning, she said. "I want to see the site in early light." She stood up, and the weight of 33 weeks was in the careful way she did it, and she went to the door, and she stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at him once. "Don't be late," she said. He wasn't. They broke ground on the Cedar House in late June. Amaja was born in the last days of July, on a Tuesday morning when the light outside the hospital window was doing the gray-to-gold transition of a coastal sunrise, after 14 hours of labor that asked everything from Imani and required from Ji-hwan the specific form of presence that cannot be performed, the kind that means staying completely and without agenda through the long hours when there is nothing useful to do except be there and mean it. He was there. He held her hand when she needed it. He stayed back when she needed space. He said almost nothing across 14 hours because she did not need his words. And he had been learning for months that silence in the presence of someone you love is not an absence, but a form of attention. When Amaya arrived, in the early morning, with the specific announcement of someone who has made a decision to exist and is not ambiguous about it, they placed her in Imani's arms, and Ji-hwan watched Imani's face change in a way that undid every remaining pretension he had about understanding what mattered. She was completely open. Every surface she maintained, and she maintained many, carefully, with good reason dissolved in approximately 3 seconds, and what was underneath was the total, unmanaged reality of a woman receiving her daughter for the first time. He had been the primary cause of those surfaces. He stood and witnessed their absence, and held this knowledge without deflecting from it. When they placed Amaya in his arms, he understood for the first time in his life what it meant to be responsible for something that was not a structure or an organization or an outcome, but a person small and total and entirely without strategy. A sound like green wood splitting, looking in the general direction of his face with the ancient, unfocused attention of someone for whom the world was still resolving into categories. He stood completely still. His hands were not fully steady. "Hi," he said, the most inadequate and most honest 2 letters available to him. Amaya continued, looking at the general vicinity of his face. He looked at Imani. She was watching him with eyes that were wet and not looking away. He looked back at his daughter. The morning light outside the window was gold now, fully committed, the way coastal mornings in Maine finally arrive after the long gray uncertainty of their beginning, not gradually, but all at once, as though the decision had been made and was now simply being executed. They moved into the Cedar House in October. On a Saturday morning when the Atlantic was running hard against the bluff, and the house smelled like new wood and salt air and the particular clean freshness of a space that had been built with intention and was now being inhabited for the first time. Amaya was 3 months old. She had opinions about most things, none of which she was willing to defer to any schedule, not of her own devising, and she had the specific quality of attention that very young people have, before they learn to distribute it strategically complete. Total, pointed at whatever she was looking at with the whole force of her small, concentrated existence. Imani stood in the kitchen on the first morning, with Amaya in the carrier against her chest, and looked out the window at the Atlantic. The light came in at the angle she had drawn 3 years ago, on a beach with a sketchbook, in a future that had seemed at the time like it belonged to both of them, and had for a while stopped belonging to either, and was now, through a process that had cost more than she had known she was signing up for when she drew the first line, actually here. She heard Ji-hwan come in from the porch. He had been out there since before she woke with coffee, in the early dark, which had become his way of beginning days. She had not asked what he did in those early hours. She understood that she did not need to know everything, to know what mattered, and what mattered was that he was there, consistently. In the morning, and at the table, and on the job site, and in the room where Amaya needed to be walked at 2 in the morning, when the world had failed to meet her standards. He was there, not perfectly. He burned Amaya's bath water temperature on the 3rd attempt and had to be redirected. He had an argument with Gary on the Portland job site about material sequencing that he was wrong about, which he acknowledged the next morning without being asked. He had 3 days in November, when the silence left by 20 years of high-stakes operational engagement was particularly loud, and he said so, which was the right thing said it at dinner, plainly, without drama. And Imani had said I know, and they had sat with it together until it passed. He was there. He came into the kitchen and moved quietly. The physical care he had developed for Amaya's sleep schedule had become a general quality of his presence in the house. An awareness of the specific weight his footsteps carried, and he refilled his coffee and set a second cup within Imani's reach without being asked. He stood beside her at the window. Neither of them spoke. The light moved across the floor in the long diagonal she had specified in the drawing. Outside, a gull crossed the window from left to right and disappeared over the bluff edge. Amaya's breathing in the carrier was the compressed, satisfied rhythm of a baby who has decided her current situation is acceptable, which was the highest she offered anyone. It's exactly like the drawing, Ji-hwan said. Better, Imani said. The drawing was flat. He was quiet for a moment. Imani. She looked at him. I know I can't write over what happened, he said. 4 years. I'm not trying to. I want to say it out loud. In this house, on the first morning of it, that I see it. What you carried and what you built and what you refused to give up, even when giving it up, would have been easier. He looked at her directly in the way she had asked him to look actually at her, not past or through. I see you. She held his gaze. Then she reached into the pocket of her robe. She placed her wedding ring on the kitchen counter between them. She looked at it for a moment. He did not move toward it. He understood this was not his to reach for. She picked it up and put it on her finger. Not with ceremony, not with the weight of a vow. The way you return something to its proper place when you have determined that the place is now actually proper, with the quiet, definitive movement of a person who knows her own mind and acts from it. She looked at her hand, then at him. "Don't make me regret it," she said. "I won't," he said. 2 words. No architecture around them. Just the words themselves and the weight of every choice that had brought them to this kitchen on this kitchen morning to stand in the light that was exactly where she had said it would be. He reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She let him, which was its own complete and unrehearsed answer. On a December evening, 4 months after they moved in, Ji-hwan put Amaya down for the night. The process took 45 minutes, which was efficient by recent standards. She had developed a clear position on the sequence of events that constituted an acceptable bedtime feeding. Then the specific kind of walking that involved a slight forward lean he had taken 2 weeks to understand was a preference rather than a random movement. Then the sound of the sea through the window, which she had opinions about in terms of volume. He had learned all of this through the unglamorous process of getting it wrong and paying attention to the results, and he had become competent at it in the way that actually mattered, which had nothing to do with performance. He came downstairs. Imani was at the kitchen table with her drawings spread out, working through a structural problem on the Portland Community Center's East Wing. Reading glasses on, coffee cold, pencil moving in the small focused strokes of someone deep inside the problem. His phone on the counter lit up, a New York number. A contact from the residual meridian transition, something that once would have had the gravitational pull of 2 decades of ingrained habit, the reflex of a man who had answered calls like this at 11 o'clock at night for 20 years because that was what he had been. He looked at the screen. He looked at Imani at the table. He silenced the call. He turned the phone face down. He pulled out the chair across from Imani and sat down. "The East Wing on the Portland Community Center," he said. "You said yesterday the load-bearing configuration at the northeast corner was giving you problems. What's the actual issue?" She looked up. She looked at him for a moment, reading something in his face, or in the face of what had just not happened, acknowledging it without naming it, and then she turned drawing toward him and pointed. "Here," she said, "this junction. The original builder ran the load-bearing wall at the wrong angle relative to the foundation. Spins. It's been holding for 60 years because the building is over-engineered everywhere else, but it's going to become a serious problem during the renovation if we don't address it properly." "What's your proposed solution?" "Transfer beam along the north face," she said. "Redistributes the load without requiring us to take down the wall, which would trigger a full structural review and add 8 months to the timeline." He leaned in and looked at where she was pointing. The math of it was straightforward once you saw the angle, and the transfer beam solution was correct, elegant, even in the way of structural solutions that work with the existing conditions rather than against them. "The beam will need to be custom fabricated," he said. "Standard stock won't carry that span." "I know," she said. "I've already got a quote. Can I see it?" She pushed a sheet across the table. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "The fabricator is overcharging by about 15%. I know someone in Portland who does this work. Better materials, better timeline, better price." Imani looked at him. "Call them tomorrow," she said. "I will," he said. She pulled the drawing back and continued working. He sat across from her and looked at the drawing and the kitchen and the light over the table and the dark knocks outside where the Atlantic was doing its patient, enormous, completely indifferent thing against the base of the bluff. And he felt the specific quality of a moment that would not record itself in any document or announcement or external account of what constituted significance. 2 people at a table, a problem being solved, a phone on the counter, face down and dark, a child sleeping upstairs, the sea outside doing what the sea had always done, long before any of them existed, and long after any of them would, and not requiring their participation to continue. Ji-hwan had lost an empire, learning that power could not give him this. Imani had nearly lost herself learning that love did not require the sacrifice of everything that made her who she was. And Amaya, upstairs, breathing in the particular concentrated way of a person who has not yet learned that the world requires anything from her except to exist in it, would grow up knowing neither lesson through pain. Outside, the December water rolled in against the Maine coast, patient and cold and permanent. Inside every window of the cedar house, the light stayed on. This was not a perfect life, but it was a true one. And true it turned out, was the only kind worth building fade out.